This morning, brothers and sisters, we hear these words from Jesus: the measure with which you measure will be measured out to you. And we can see this in the context of what Jesus is saying in the gospel today, that the measure of mercy that we have towards others will also be the measure of mercy that God has for us. Meaning God is expecting us to have great faith and great mercy for others because he has great mercy and great love for us. But we can also take this in another way, and that is that the measure of faith which we have is what God will then measure out to us. And we see in the first reading from Genesis, Abraham has a great measure of faith. What we don't hear in today's reading is that he has already left his own hometown of Ur, and then he has moved by the prompting of the Lord to go to Haran. Now he happens to have family members also in this town of Haran, but he's already let the Lord take away what was normal for him and what he was used to then venture out to a new place, though he had some comfort. And then God calls him further to have greater faith, to have a greater surrender to God, to then set out to the land of Canaan, where he knows nobody and he has no inheritance, but God, who is this inheritance, promises his descendants the inheritance of the land of Canaan. So brothers and sisters, the same thing is true for us. Now we hear in the opening prayer, as we celebrate St. Aloysius Gonzaga, who was a Jesuit, who was known to be a holy and pious young Jesuit who died young, that though we may not have followed him in innocence, that we can certainly follow him in penitence. But what I'd like to point out is perhaps this, that part of the penitence isn't just the idea of doing prayer and fasting, but it's specifically allowing the Lord to renew our mind to such a way that by God's grace, God can make us as innocent as St. Aloysius, or even as innocent and as holy, dare I say it, now don't think I'm being heretical when I say it, as holy as the Blessed Virgin Mary. How can I say this? Because the grace that God gives to us, the measure of his gift, of his love for us, is the same for every single person. It is the grace of Jesus' death and resurrection, his death on the cross, his precious blood poured out for us. And Mary received that at the moment of her conception. She also received communion from St. John the Evangelist. We assume multiple times. But we can imagine how many times we receive that same grace of Jesus' death and resurrection in baptism, in confession, in communion. So what we want to do, and what we're invited to do this morning, is to have great faith in the working and the power of God's grace. The working and power of God's grace to cleanse us, to cause us to be transformed into not only saints, but great saints, and also to teach us how to give more and more to God after the example of Abraham. Because let's face it, when God calls us to follow him, he doesn't give us a map. And if he gives you a map, let me know. I'd like to follow it too. But to each person, God has a particular journey where he calls us more and more to step out in trust and in faith, to listen to God's promptings, and to be willing to step out in boldness to proclaim the gospel by word and to demonstrate it by deed, especially through praying for others and praying for the sick and healing them as Jesus has commanded us. So we ask Jesus, whom we receive in this Eucharistic banquet, that he may continue to pour out the fullness of the measure of his grace and that is all of the fullness of God. Amen.